I should begin by confessing that I am not the hero of this story. That title belongs, beyond all argument, to my grandmother. My name is Edmund Ashford. I am the younger brother of the Duke of Ashford, a man known in the 3 counties that border his estate as the most unreachable nobleman in England, which was the polite way of saying that he was terrifying. Not cruel, never cruel, simply closed, sealed as a house in winter, perfectly ordered and utterly impenetrable, and most people in our world found it easier to admire him from a distance than to actually know him. I knew him, of course. I had grown up with him. I had watched him at 12 years old carry an injured fox a quarter-mile to the groundskeeper's cottage rather than leave it, and then spend 3 days checking on its recovery, and never once tell a soul. I had watched him, at the age of 20, sit beside our father's bed through an entire night without sleeping, his face as still as a church wall, and then weep, only once, briefly, when he thought no one could see in the corridor after. My brother James was not an unfeeling man. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that feelings were his own private property, and he kept them behind a wall so high that most of the world assumed there was nothing behind it at all. He was, by the autumn I am describing, 30 years old. He had been the Duke of Ashford for 11 years. He had in those 11 years refused, with the exquisite courtesy of a man who has never in his life needed to shout, 4 separate marriage arrangements, 2 of them orchestrated by my father before his death, 2 of them engineered by my grandmother afterward. My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, was 72 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and the single most strategically intelligent person I have ever encountered in my life. She had been married to the previous Duke for 44 years and had outlasted him by a decade. And in those 10 years of widowhood, she had occupied herself primarily by running the family's charitable concerns, managing the tenancy disputes that James was too busy to mediate personally, reading everything she could find, and planning what she referred to, without any apparent embarrassment, as the campaign. The campaign was simply getting my brother married. "He will be old before he admits to needing anyone," she said to me once over tea at Ashford House, with the serenity of a general who has already won a battle and is simply waiting for the map to catch up. "So I shall need to get there before him." She had tried, as I said, twice already. Both women had been perfectly respectable. One had been a viscount's daughter of considerable beauty and almost no particular interests. James had been polite to her for exactly 5 days, and then written my grandmother a letter so gentle and so final that the viscount's daughter later reportedly told a friend she could not be certain she had actually been refused, only that she found herself no longer engaged. The second had been a widow of property and some intelligence, and I had privately thought James might warm to her, but he hadn't. He had told me afterward, in that quiet way of his, that she was a very fine woman and he hoped she would be happy, and then changed the subject to a drainage problem on the East Field. My grandmother did not sulk. She recalibrated. And in the first week of October, she appeared at Ashford House with a young woman in tow, and an explanation so casual it was, in retrospect, almost offensive in its transparency. "The library," she said, "is in a disgraceful state. I have found someone to put it right." Miss Eliza Vane was 23. She was not beautiful in the way the county balls catalogued beauty. She had none of the golden ringlets and Dresden doll complexion that the illustrated papers celebrated. She was slight and brown-haired, with a long, composed face and eyes of a color I could never quite decide on, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light. She was neat. She was quiet. She carried herself with the particular upright stillness of a woman who has learned very early that no one is going to make room for her, and has accordingly decided to take up exactly as much space as she requires and not an inch more. She was the daughter of a country clergyman who had died 3 years prior. She had spent the intervening time as a lady's companion to a series of elderly women in the neighboring counties, reading to them, writing their correspondence, translating their French when their French failed, and being, by all reports, thoroughly indispensable and thoroughly invisible. My grandmother had encountered her at the house of Mrs. Fellows of Holt, where Eliza had apparently spent an afternoon translating a letter from a Parisian cousin that everyone else in the household had pronounced untranslatable, and had done it without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. My grandmother had noted this. My grandmother noted everything. I had, before I met Miss Vane, assumed she would be one of those timid creatures my grandmother occasionally collected, women of good breeding and absolute blankness who existed, in aristocratic households, primarily as a kind of decorative utility. The companion who is always just out of the frame. The governess who answers when spoken to and otherwise dissolves into the wallpaper. Miss Vane was not that. I understood this within the first 10 minutes of making her acquaintance, which happened on the morning of her arrival, when I found her in the entrance hall studying the portrait of our great-great-grandfather, with an expression of frank assessment that struck me as entirely unsuited to someone who had been employed to organize a library and was supposed to be invisible. "He looks cross," she said without turning, apparently aware that someone had come into the hall. "He was by all accounts," I said. "He also lost a considerable sum in a card game in 1762, and never quite recovered from the insult to his pride." She turned then, and there was a smile on her face that surprised me, not a polite smile, but a quick, genuine one, as if I had said something actually funny rather than something reflexively conversational. "Edmund Ashford," I said, "the lesser brother." "Miss Vane," she said, "the current librarian." She looked up at the portrait again. "There is something to be said for a man who takes cards seriously enough to be ruined by them," she said. "At least he believed in something." I liked her immediately. I went to find James. "She is not what you are expecting," I told him. "I am not expecting anything," he said, which was, I thought, the kind of thing only a man who is expecting a great deal would say. "She told our great-great-grandfather he looked cross," I said. James looked at me. "He does look cross." "Yes," I said, "but she said it." He went back to his correspondence. "She will organize the East Wing Library," my grandmother said to James at dinner that first evening, with a perfect performance of having given the matter very little thought. "It will take perhaps a month. I have already arranged her lodging in the house. She will be no trouble at all." James looked at our grandmother with the expression he always wore when he suspected she was doing something, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a stillness about the jaw. Then he looked at Miss Vane, who was seated 3 chairs down and who was attending to her soup with the focused quiet of a woman who has learned to be furniture in other people's households. "As you like," James said. I watched him. He was watching her. I said nothing. The library occupied Miss Vane for the better part of the first week without her surfaces overlapping with James's at any point. He had his own schedule, the estate correspondence in the morning, the tenant meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the evening papers in the West drawing room, and she had hers. She ate with the household at the secondary table in the mornings and was largely absent from the formal rooms. On the 8th day, a Wednesday, James walked into the East Wing Library to retrieve a surveyor's report he had mislaid somewhere in the previous month's accumulated disorder, and found Miss Vane standing on the second rung of the library ladder with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and approximately 4 volumes of agricultural census records tucked under one arm. I heard about this from Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, who had been in the adjoining room and could not help but note the subsequent conversation through the wall. James said, "Good morning." Miss Vane said, "Good morning, Your Grace," and did not come down from the ladder or rearrange her sleeves. James said he was looking for a surveyor's report, possibly from March. Miss Vane said that March of this year or last. James said he was not entirely certain. Miss Vane said that would narrow it somewhat, and asked him whether it was for the Holt Road or the Lower Meadow. When he said the Lower Meadow, she descended the ladder, crossed the room without hurry, produced the report from the second shelf of the middle section, which she had apparently already reorganized, and handed it to him. Then she went back to the ladder. James stood there for a moment. "Have you organized the entirety of the East section already?" he said. "Yes," Miss Vane said. "I intend to begin the West section on Friday." "You've been here 9 days. 8, she said, and then, as if it had only just occurred to her that this might sound like a correction, "Forgive me. 8, Your Grace." 8, James said. "The cataloging system was, if I may say so, idiosyncratic," she said. She had the air of someone choosing words carefully, not because she was afraid, but because she believed in precision. "My father organized it. It has a certain logic," she said, and the pause before it was almost a kind of grace. "It simply required some time to understand." There was a silence. James looked at the surveyor's report in his hand and then back at her. "Thank you," he said. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, and climbed back up the ladder. He left. Mrs. Prentice, who had been holding her breath on the other side of the wall, subsequently reported to me that he had stood outside the library door for a count of at least 10 before walking away. I found this deeply interesting. The second notable incident occurred 11 days later. At a small dinner my grandmother had engineered with the air of someone who simply happened to have invited a handful of family members and close connections to the house at the same time. Miss Vane was present, which I suspected had not been my grandmother's original intention. That is, I suspected it had always been her exact intention, and the surprise was purely theatrical. The gentleman at the far end, a cousin of ours named Percival Stanhope, who had the habit of speaking loudly and at length on any subject he felt confident about, was holding forth on the recent trouble at a local parish, which he summarized with some confidence, in a piece of Latin he attributed to Augustine. "Non est inventum verum," Percival said with great authority, which, as you know, means the truth has not been found. There was a small silence. From her place near the middle of the table, where she had been composedly attending to her food and saying very little, Miss Vane said, "I believe the phrase is from Cicero, Mr. Stanhope, the De Natura Deorum, and the translation is closer to the truth has not yet been discovered, which carries a rather different implication." The table went quiet. Percival stared at her. Miss Vane's eyes moved once briefly to James at the head of the table, not in appeal, I thought, but in the involuntary way of a person who has just spoken before they entirely meant to, and then returned to her plate. James said quite calmly, "Miss Vane is correct." Percival made a noise in his throat and said that he had been told it was Augustine. "Cicero," James said, and reached for his wine, and the conversation moved on. Later, when the party had dispersed to the drawing room and my grandmother was speaking with a great-aunt near the fire, I contrived to stand beside James near the window. "She corrected Percival's Latin," I said. "She corrected Percival's attribution and his translation," James said. "Is there a difference?" "Apparently," James said, and drank his wine. His eyes moved across the room to where Miss Vane was standing near the bookcase, having been drawn into conversation by our great-aunt's companion, a kind elderly woman who asked a great many questions and listened to all the answers. Miss Vane was answering something, and in answering had become, for a moment, briefly, alive in a way she was not when she was trying not to be noticed. Her hands moved. Her expression opened. James watched this for a moment. "She's wasted as a library cataloger," he said, which was, from my brother, an extraordinary thing to say about anyone. I said nothing, I simply filed it. He began, after that dinner, to arrange his mornings differently. It was subtle. It would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. But the surveyor's report had required a return visit, and the return visit had become a habit, and the habit had quietly migrated, over the course of the following 2 weeks, into a standing morning arrangement in which the Duke of Ashford, who had never in living memory shown any particular interest in his own East Wing library, was somehow spending 40 minutes in it every day. I watched from a discreet distance. What I observed was this: they argued. Not loudly, not cruelly. But James would come in with a point of view on something, the management of a particular trust, the interpretation of a clause in a tenancy agreement, the best approach to a drainage problem that had been plaguing the lower pasture for 5 years, and Miss Vane would either agree with him or she would not, and when she did not, she said so. Calmly, precisely. With the kind of well-organized reasoning that James, I could see, found entirely irresistible because it was exactly the kind of reasoning he used himself, deployed back at him without either deference or rancor. I should say that this was, in our household, extraordinary. James was not accustomed to being contradicted. It was not that he had surrounded himself with sycophants. He had too little patience for them to last. But the people who were left, after the sycophants had gone, were mostly people who were simply quieter than their disagreements. They did not push back. They accommodated. And James, being James, had accepted this arrangement, and had, over the course of 11 years as the Duke, quietly forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually think at him. Miss Vane thought at him. It was, from the outside, like watching a man who has been dining on plain bread suddenly discover that there was a kitchen full of other ingredients the whole time, and feel, with some combination of relief and exasperation, why was no one using these? Once, I was near enough to the door to catch a longer fragment than usual. James said, "You disagree." Miss Vane said, "I think there may be a second reading." James said, "I've considered the second reading." Miss Vane said, "And?" A pause. I imagined him standing there with his particular expression, the one where he was recalculating something behind perfectly still features. "And it's possible you're right," James said, and from the quality of the silence afterward, I understood that this was not a thing he said often, and that he was saying it now with a kind of relief I suspected surprised him. There was another pause. Then Miss Vane said dryly, "You don't need to sound as though it's causing you pain." And James laughed. He laughed briefly, quietly, the kind of laugh a sealed man produces when something has caught him genuinely off guard. And I heard it from the corridor and had to put my hand against the wall for support, because in 36 years I could count on one hand the number of times I had heard my brother produce that sound and mean it. I walked away before either of them could see me standing there like an idiot in the hall. I had learned what I needed to know. My grandmother, throughout all of this, radiated the serene satisfaction of a chess player watching the board arrange itself exactly as she had intended. She said very little to me about it. She said even less to James, which was, I understood, tactical. Any appearance of investment on her part would send James, who had a profound resistance to being managed, immediately toward the door. So she simply kept Miss Vane in the house, kept the library project quietly ongoing, and waited. I should say here that I liked Miss Vane enormously by this point. Not in any romantic sense. I was newly engaged to a young woman named Margaret, whom I adored, and my heart was very thoroughly accounted for. But there was something about Eliza Vane that made a room feel better organized without being oppressive about it, and she asked questions that were actually questions rather than assertions in question form, and she had a dry, private humor that emerged only in the careful company of people she had decided to trust. And I was flattered to find that she appeared, somewhere in the third week, to have added me to that group. "Your brother," she said to me one afternoon in the corridor outside the library. She had been carrying a stack of atlases, and I had taken half of them from her, "is not what I expected." "No," I said, "he rarely is. What did you expect?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. "Someone more theatrical," she said finally. "The county reputation suggests drama. I find him very quiet." "He is very quiet," I said. "Quiet people," she said carefully, "are often the ones with the most to say." She took back her atlases and went into the library, and I stood in the corridor and thought about that for rather longer than the remark perhaps warranted. I had spent a good portion of my life watching my brother from a careful distance, in the way that younger siblings learn to watch the older ones who are not easy to approach, not because they are unkind, but because they are so complete in themselves that approach requires a kind of courage. James had always been that way. He did not invite people in. He was not cold exactly, but he was sealed, and the difference between coldness and sealing is this: a cold man does not want you. A sealed man wants nothing from you, which is a more disorienting thing to encounter because it offers no foothold. Eliza Vane, I had come to understand, was also sealed, but her sealing was different in kind. His came from sufficiency, from having, somewhere early, decided he was adequate on his own terms and needed no supplementing. Hers came from long experience of being overlooked, of making herself small and precise and perfectly useful as a way of surviving rooms that were not designed with her in mind. They were, I thought, sealed in complementary directions, and I wondered, with the idle curiosity of a man who reads too many novels, what happened when two sealed things found each other. I also, I confess, went directly to find my grandmother. She was in the morning room, writing letters, and she looked up at me when I came in with the expression of a woman who has not been surprised in approximately 40 years. "He's going to do it himself," I said. "You won't even have to push." "I know," she said, and went back to her letter. "You knew from the beginning." "I knew from Mrs. Fellowes' house," she said. "The moment I watched her translate that letter without being asked and then go back to her chair without a word of it. She does not perform. Your brother has spent 38 years surrounded by people who perform. He has no tolerance for it. He simply needed to encounter someone who didn't." She signed her letter with the calm finality of someone concluding a proof. "The library is nearly finished," she added. "I give it another week." She gave it 10 days, which I think even she had not quite anticipated. Miss Vane was efficient nearly to a fault, and at the end of those 10 days my grandmother announced, over a dinner that she had assembled with the same theatrical casualness as the first, that she had something to say. James was at the head of the table. I was at his left. Miss Vane was 4 seats down, across from our great-aunt. Percival Stanhope had not been invited this time, which my grandmother had arranged with a precision I found quietly impressive. My grandmother set down her glass, patted her mouth with her napkin, and said, in the tone of someone reading from a pleasant list, "I have, I believe, arranged a rather suitable match. I shan't be coy about it. Miss Vane is exactly the woman this family has needed for some time, and I have done what I could to make the matter evident to those concerned. I shall be very surprised if it is not settled within the fortnight." The table absorbed this in the silence of people who had all suspected something was happening, but had not quite prepared for it to be announced between the soup and the fish. I looked at my brother. James had set down his own glass. He was looking at my grandmother with the expression he wore when he had already thought several steps ahead of the person talking. Then he looked, briefly, at Miss Vane. Miss Vane's face was, I shall be honest, extraordinary to watch. She had the look of someone who had known, in the abstract, that a thing might be said, and had believed herself prepared for it, and had just discovered that preparation and reality were entirely different animals. She was very still. Her color had changed slightly. She was looking at her plate with the composure of a woman holding a great deal of something in a very small container. "Grandmother," James said, and his voice was perfectly level, "I appreciate, as always, your effort." My grandmother smiled. "However," he said. The smile did not waver. She was, I thought, exactly like a woman holding a very good hand of cards. "However," James said again, "I should tell you that I have been attempting for approximately 3 weeks to determine the right moment to speak to Miss Vane myself, and I confess I find your announcement somewhat ahead of schedule." There was a silence of a quality I have never quite experienced before or since. It was the silence of a table at which everyone was trying very hard not to look at either of the 2 people at the center of it. Miss Vane looked up. She looked at James. He was looking directly at her, with the expression I had learned over a lifetime of being his brother, was the one he wore only when he had already decided something and was simply saying it aloud. "I had thought," he said steadily, as though there were no one else at the table, "to ask whether you might consider staying. Not for the library. The library is finished. I understand that. But I find, Miss Vane, that I have become uncharacteristically interested in your opinion on a great many things, and I should like, if you are willing, the opportunity to go on consulting you for rather longer than the East Wing catalog requires." The table held its collective breath. Miss Vane said, in a voice that was very composed and only slightly unsteady at the edges, "That is a very carefully worded proposal, Your Grace." "I'm a careful man," James said. "You are," she said, a pause, "I have noticed." "Is it a yes?" he said. Something moved across her face, relief and astonishment, and something older than both, some private thing that had been waiting a long time to be called by name. "It is a yes," she said. My grandmother set down her napkin and reached for her wine with the equanimity of a woman, receiving the natural result of a well-executed plan. I looked at James. He was still looking at Eliza Vane, and there was in his face, carefully, privately, in the way he felt everything, a warmth so complete and so unguarded that I felt, for a moment, I was seeing something I had not seen in him since he was a boy walking a quarter-mile through the frost with an injured fox in his arms. He had not been tricked into it. He had not been pushed or arranged or maneuvered. He had simply, at last, found someone whose presence rearranged the room in a way he had no desire to undo, and decided to say so. My grandmother knew it. I believe she had known it the moment she introduced them. The only person who had not known it, until this particular Wednesday evening, was Miss Eliza Vane herself, who had, in the 8 weeks she had spent in Ashford House cataloging 2 centuries of accumulated reading, quietly and without announcing it, become entirely necessary to the most unreachable man I have ever loved. I want to describe what happened in the moment after he said it, before she answered, because I think it is the most honest thing I witnessed in that entire room, and honesty is what memory owes to the people it carries. Eliza Vane sat entirely still for perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time in most circumstances. In a room full of people waiting for an answer from a woman who had just been proposed to, however indirectly, however carefully worded, 4 seconds is its own sort of eternity. She looked at him, and I saw in her face the same thing I had seen in her expression the very first morning when she had looked at our great-great-grandfather's portrait and said he looked cross, that quality of frank assessment, entirely unperformed. She was looking at James the way she looked at everything, directly, with curiosity and without decoration, as if she were still making up her mind about him, as if she had not, perhaps, let herself fully make it up until now. And then, quietly, without ceremony, in the way she did everything, she made up her mind. He did ask her properly, as James did everything, thoroughly and without flourish. He walked with her in the gardens the following morning, in the thin October light, and they were out for 2 hours, and when they came back in she was wearing the same composed expression she always wore, and he was wearing an expression I cannot describe except to say I had never seen it on him before. They sat together at luncheon and argued about the drainage of the lower pasture. She had a theory. He had a counter-theory. She was right, as it turned out, and he acknowledged it with the same quiet equanimity he'd shown in the library weeks before. And it was then, I think, that I understood precisely what my grandmother had understood from the beginning. It was not a softening. James did not soften. He was still the most contained man in the county, and he would be, I suspected, for the rest of his life. But there is a difference between a sealed house and a house with a fire in it, and Eliza Vane was the fire. She had not broken his reserve. She had made the reserve unnecessary, by being someone in whose presence he did not feel the need of it, and this, for James, was something that had not happened before. They were married in December, quietly, at the estate chapel, in the presence of the immediate family and a small number of close connections. My grandmother wore an expression of such triumphant serenity throughout the proceedings that Percival Stanhope, who had not been invited but had somehow arrived anyway, later told several people that the Dowager Duchess looked as though she had personally arranged the weather. She had not arranged the weather. She had, however, arranged everything else. I stood beside James during the ceremony, as his brother and his witness, and when it was done, and Eliza was his wife and the small assembly had relaxed into the warmth of the reception, I found my grandmother at my shoulder. "You knew the whole time?" I said. "Of course," she said. "He knew what you were doing." "Also from the beginning," she said. "He told me so afterward. He said he'd recognized the scheme from the first dinner." She paused. "He also said he was grateful." I looked across the room to where James was standing with his wife, who was speaking to our great-aunt with her particular focused animation, and James was watching her with the steady, private attention of a man who has found the thing he has been looking for, and intends to go on looking at it for the rest of his life. "Grateful," I said. "He said," my grandmother continued, smoothing her glove, "that he had been trying to find a way to introduce himself to her without it seeming as though he needed anything, and I had very kindly resolved the difficulty by putting her in his house." I thought about this. "So you were, in fact, useful." "I am," my grandmother said, "always useful." She patted my arm. "Now go and find your Margaret. She has been very patient through all of this." I did, and I left my brother, the most guarded and most loyal man I have ever known, standing in the candle-lit warmth of his own house beside the woman who had catalogued his library, corrected his cousin's Latin, been right about the drainage of the lower pasture, and said yes to him across a dinner table with the composure of someone who had, perhaps, been hoping to be asked for longer than she had admitted to anyone, least of all herself. There are people in this world, I have observed them only rarely, who do not fall in love in the way the novels describe it. They do not tumble, they do not catch fire. They simply find, one day, that someone has become so woven into the texture of their thinking that the world without them is unimaginable, and they stand there with that discovery in their hands, very quietly, the way my brother stood outside a library door for a count of 10, not entirely knowing what to do next. He knew what to do in the end. He always did. And my grandmother had known he would, which was, I think, the truest act of love she had ever performed for him. Not the scheming, not the dinner parties, not even the elegant implausibility of making the whole thing look like a library project. But the faith, all along, that James Ashford was exactly the man she had always known him to be. He simply needed someone worth the showing. He had found her. And the house, Ashford House, with its sealed rooms and its frozen reputation and its terrible, unreachable Duke, had at last a fire in it.